what we traditionally call a sugar maple. You can see the leaf, and its basic shape is probably one of the simplest to identify. A straight, traditional shape. However, there's one interesting characteristic about the maple trees, and that is the fact that all their leaves are opposite. Now let me explain that with another example. Wherever you find leaves on one side of a branch, you'll find them on another. Right here, you see a pair of leaves. That means that these leaves are opposite. Here is another set of leaves. These leaves are opposite. Check this branch down here. See? Here we have a set of opposite leaves. Here we have a set of opposite leaves. Maple are one class of trees that have opposite leaves, and there are only a few of those, so maple leaves are easy to remember. In addition to that, we all can recognize a traditional maple leaf. It's a little more difficult to tell red maple sometimes from the sugar maple. Now in my arm here, under my arm, I have another kind of maple leaf which is slightly different. This leaf is from a silver maple tree. Take a close look at the two leaves. Do you see how this lobe here is not serrated as near deeply as it is here on the silver maple? And all these leaves will be deeply serrated with sharp lobes coming out. Once again, this tree is a silver maple as composed to the sugar maple. Since it's a maple, however, let's look again and see if it passes the same test for opposite leaves. Here on the twig we see opposite leaves. There where I broke one leaf off and another leaf off, opposite leaves. Here again, opposite leaves. Deep, sharp indentations on the leaf, silver maple. And here you see the traditional shape of our hard maple. Alright, let's turn it off and see if we can find another tree somewhere we want to spend some time with. These two trees we're going to talk about are members here. The next two trees we want to discuss here and learn how to identify are members of the locust family. Look first of all at the differences in these branches. The branch here in my left hand is almost straight, and the leaflets come off at almost a 90-degree turn. In my right, you see a branch, a lot of turning, a lot of twisting, and a lot of configurations in it. Both of these are locusts. Don't get confused when you think that one little green spot is a leaf. That is not true of this particular species. This whole branch right there represents a leaf. And all these little green appendages are called leaflets. Long, oval, alternately stacked up and down the twig. However, as we start to take a few more of these leaves off, you can see the interesting characteristic of a black locust. And that is, you see the large, sharp spines, the barbs, almost like a briar bush. On the other hand, honey locust, which is another member of the locust family, has smooth twigs. They're not nearly as straight, but this branch also, this tree here, that represents one leaf. Now count how many leaflets we have on here. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, and the end one makes 15 leaflets on this particular branch. The black locust, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, it also has 15. How do you tell the two apart? The easiest way is to get down in on a branch and look for barbs. If it has barbs, it's most likely going to be a black locust because, as we've learned already, the honey locust is smooth bark. All right, let's see if we can find two more. Okay. This tree right here is a member of the spruce family, and I hope you all can see the bluish tint to its foliage. It's easy to remember. The individual needles are somewhere between 5/8 to 3/4 of an inch long, but the most distinguishing characteristic of this tree is the bluish hue given off by the tree, and that's why it's very well known as the blue spruce. This tree is a tree that's not really popular as a forest tree, and it's not really important as a forest tree. However, it passes one of the tests which we need to learn for tree identification or dendrology, and that is the fact that it has opposite leaves. One thing you should always remember is the phrase mad horse. Maple, ash, dogwood, and horse chestnut have opposite leaves. Now let's look at this branch. Here's a twig. We can see that it has a pair of opposite leaves. Here's another twig. You can see that it has opposite leaves. And so this tree has opposite leaves, obviously. That means it is automatically a member of the maple, the ash, the dogwood, or it is a horse chestnut. Well, you've already seen maple. You know that it's not a maple. And an ash, it's not an ash. And I don't think looks like a nut leaf. And so we're going to have to say, this must be then a dogwood. Note the shape of the leaf. It's in the fall, and these leaves are starting to turn color, and they turn a beautiful pinkish shade, as you can see in our video here. Most of the time, however, the leaves are green, as would any other leaf be green during the growing season. All right, what's next? The representative of the tree that I have in my hand is called a catalpa tree. It's primarily an ornamental, and its seeds are borne in long, green, slender stalks that almost look like a large green bean. Now we have another one back on here that is starting to open, and as I open this up, you can see in here a fiber that contains many seeds of the tree. These start to hang in midsummer until they reach maturity at this time of the year, at which time they would fall. This tree also can be identified by the very large leaves. One of the largest leaf trees in the northeastern United States, the catalpa, and this leaf here, although it's the largest one on the branch that I've cut, is not by any means the largest leaf on this tree, as you can see from the video, as we made the video from a distance. The bottom of these leaves are hairy, and these leaves are great for shade, and oftentimes you'll see trees like this one, just as this one here is, used as an ornamental because of the shade value that they have. The disadvantage in this tree as an ornamental, however, is that every year a person has to go around and pick up all the fallings from these long seed pods. Once again, this is called a catalpa tree. Next. What we have right here, as we're zooming in, is the top of what's called a quaking aspen. It's called quaking aspen because even though there's very, very little wind today, you can see the movement in these branches. It's almost like they're shaking or shivering. And the leaf is called a quaking aspen. We're going to stop the video now. We're going to try and get one of those limbs, and we'll identify and we'll discuss the leaf and the branching pattern of the quaking aspen in a little bit more detail. See the color of the quaking aspen. Very light gray. Branches come out almost at a 90-degree angle to it. And here are some of the, here's a branch that I've cut off this particular tree. I'm going to bring it in closer, we're going to zoom in, and we'll talk. But this tree is one to identify because of its gray color here on the bark, and the gray comes all the way out the branches. New growth, however, has a tendency to be a little bit more brown than gray. This is the shape of a traditional aspen. And see this, when the leaves are on a small branch, you can see how small they are. But again, and even look at them quake in my hand with the little breeze that's blowing. And one of the reasons they do that is because these leaflets have small, flat stems, and so there's nothing to hold it, and so with the lightest breeze, it will shake as these are right now. That would be a good traditional shape right there, if I can hold it steady, for an aspen. And you can see the larger leaf, which came off the large tree here behind me, and this came off a small branch low near the ground on a young seedling that was starting out. Quaking aspen. Look at the buds also on this particular branch. Notice that they're reddish brown, they're slightly curved. However, these buds are very, very close in and tight to the twig. The ends come to a very, very fine point also. These two trees we're going to learn to differentiate here are willows. Immediately here in the foreground you can see a black willow. See the leaves and the difference that they have as opposed to the weeping willow, which we'll scan to on the other side. A weeping willow is called weeping willow because all the branches hang down, they're very soft, they move a lot with the wind, and they're very ornamental and oftentimes found around wet, swampy areas. The large weeping willow you're looking at in the background behind the trailer is right along the stream banks where they're very often found. The black willow here in front of us has a different limbing pattern, however, and also a different leaf pattern. You can see that the leaves are elliptical, they're pointed, and it's late enough in the year now, it would be difficult for us to find a good branch to discuss the leaves in this tree. But here we see a black willow and a weeping willow. This clump of trees is probably the easiest tree, or one of the easiest trees to identify. The color white gives it away to its name, white birch. The leaves come out to a rather sharp point at the end. The easiest way, however, to determine this tree is simply looking at the bark of the tree, and when it's white like that, it's a dead giveaway for white birch. The leaves are slightly rough, as are all members of the birch family. The twigs, however, when you only have a twig, this can be a little bit more difficult to identify, and so perhaps you need to learn the pointing characteristic of the leaves of a white birch tree. In the immediate foreground here, you see two large specimen trees, which the most interesting... I missed all that. Started all over again. I wasn't taping it, I thought I was. The two large trees here in the immediate forefront have a characteristic that is indigenous to one species of tree. The bark separates from the main trunk and gives the trunk of the tree a very shaggy appearance. As a result, this tree is easy to identify and is known as the shagbark hickory. Furthermore, it is a great producer of acorns and is very important in the northern hardwoods. What I say, acorn, I'm sorry, hickory nuts. It produces hickory nuts and is an excellent hardwood and also an excellent source of firewood. Shagbark hickory. Perhaps we can find a smaller tree up in the woods and use that with a little bit of leaf identification. There are some variations in size and shapes of hickory nuts. We're still underneath the two shagbark hickories which we just shown, and here you can see the hickory nut as the husk begins to dry, it falls apart, and the hickory nut can be exposed. Here's one just in the beginning stages, and yet each quarter will drop off very easily. Hickory nuts are a very valuable source of food to squirrels. This tree right here is very, very common in the north central hardwoods forest. Look at the bark. It looks sinewy. It looks like a muscle all the way up and down. The leaves are shaped a lot like a birch leaf on the black birch. To differentiate them between a birch, you have to look very, very closely at the edge of the leaf for the tiny little serrations. This leaf is said to be serrated. It means that it has little tiny teeth around the perimeter or the margin of the leaf. If you look more closely at it, you'll see that every so often, here, 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 coming up this side here, and then in here, there tends to be a larger serration. This tree is ironwood. Ironwood. It's most easily identified, however, not by the leaf, but by the muscle-like look of the bark. Ironwood. The slate gray color of this large bark tree here, and as well as all the cluster in here, or most of the cluster in here, give this away as being a beech tree or American beech. Let's look more closely at the leaf. There's a good example for the shape of a leaf. Most easily identified, in addition to the slate gray color of the bark and the limbs, is the fact that this leaf tends to be waxy or smooth as you rub your fingers over it. Also, very small serrations on the edge, unlike the hop hornbeam or the ironwood which you just saw. Here, a young sapling is a classic example of a tree that's very, very similar to ironwood, and it is called hornbeam. Little tiny flakes of bark, always being shed by the tree. The leaves are too high, we can't get them, but the leaves are very similar to an ironwood leaf as well. Okay. This is an excellent specimen of a rock oak. It's found high up on mountain ridges where, as the name might apply, it is oftentimes found growing in rock outcroppings or where there's a large percentage of rocks in the soil. Other oaks in this area, we need to learn to identify white oak, red oak, and rock oak. Now let's take a closer look at the leaf on this particular tree. The leaflets will be as long as 7 to 9 inches. However, the lobes tend to be slightly rounded and not coming out to a point, as we'll find on red oak and not deeply indented with lobes as we'll find on a white oak. The bark on the tree has very deep indentations with ridges all the way up and down the tree. The quality of wood, this is not as good as red oak, nor as good as white oak as a source of lumber. However, it is a popular oak in the north central hardwoods forest. This tree again is a rock oak, identified by the shape of its leaf. Chestnut oak is similar to this. However, the tips of the lobes on a chestnut oak will have a slight point on them. This tree right here is also a member of the oak family, but look at the difference in the bark. The other tree had deep, hard lines, a lot of ridges and valleys up and down. This tree here is much smoother. Now let's take a minute and look at the leaf. You can see the comparison to the last rock oak, and here you can see a picture of the red oak. Notice that the point, it's very deeply indented, and the lobes tend to be pointed. This is very, very similar to a white oak, but on a white oak, the lobes at the end, the leaflet right here, is rounded. It will have this same basic shape with rounded lobes. A red oak, the edges of the leaves are pointed, as you see on this one right here. The bark is much smoother than that on a rock oak. On a white oak, this would have a tendency to have white scales up and down the bark which would fall off. This is a very good northern hardwood red oak. This leaf is a very good example of the elm family. Look very closely at the shape, but more important, look at the bottom of the leaf. See how the two margins do not line up? That's a characteristic of elm. This tree is a red elm. Perhaps we can find another one. See the bottom of the leaves? They do not match. This one is called red elm. Standing right beside an excellent example of a black cherry. Bark peels off in chunks, very rough, very coarse. It is an excellent hardwood. It is used a lot in furniture and is a very expensive hardwood. Let's just take a minute or two and look at some of the leaves. The leaves are alternate, they're very long, they're quite smooth. And the edges, if you look very closely, have a tendency to have a very, very slight serration. However, they're not sharp edges like we saw on previous examples with sharp serrated edges. They're just slightly lobed in, and you almost have to look at it with the magnifying glass to see how it's serrated. Here's another good example of a black cherry. If you're in doubt and you only have a branch to chew on or to observe and to look at, you can take this bark, chew it off, and wild cherry has a distinct, almost an acid flavor that lingers on the tongue. You want to spit it out and get rid of it quickly. This is a good test to use between the bark of a birch, which has a very obviously birchy flavor, which sometimes people will chew off and just chew on, but you certainly wouldn't want to do it. This is a prime example of an ash. Most easily identified by the very, very strong vertical lines in the bark with the small fissures in it. If you think back on the video, a few minutes ago we looked at a rock oak. These fissures in here were very, very deep, probably 1.5 inches deep. on this tree here, and you can see it's starting to get some size to it. These fissures are only about a ½ inch deep. This is the bark for an ash, and perhaps we'll be able to get a leaf sometime and add to the video to show an ash leaf. Remember at the beginning of the video we also talked about mad dog, and we have a mad dog right here with us right now. Since this is ash, you know that the leaves will be opposite on an ash tree. Here's some good examples of one of the oak family. We're going to pause the tape for a few minutes and give you a chance to identify this oak based upon the literature you have in your handouts. We'll tell you it's a member of the oak family. You tell me, which particular oak tree is it? This tree right here is a good example of a member of the birch family. Birch have leaves that are shaped a lot like the hornbeam you saw earlier. However, the bark, you can see small little horizontal lines in this, which are one of its characteristics, but also the bark can be pulled off in sheets like this. This will be a black birch. There's another one of these trees, in addition to the white birch which was on this video, which even has the bark rolling up more, and instead of being so dark as this, has a tendency to be a little more yellowish. And that would be called a yellow birch. Yellow birch trees, one of their distinguishing characteristics is that they are excellent. If you're ever stuck in the woods, you peel the bark off, and there's enough oil in that bark that it will burn. Even though the tree is wet, that bark will burn. This is a black birch. Let me ask the question this time. Who can tell what it is? Look closely at the leaves, especially the bottom of the leaf. This one here is a good example. Notice how the leaves do not come together at the bottom. That distinguishing characteristic automatically tells us this has to be an elm. Now, because we can see the fruit on the twig over here, go back into your literature and tell me, is this a red elm or is this a slippery elm? Which one has fruit borne like this? Is this a slippery elm or is this a red elm? Years ago, we looked at a tree just like this one. Earlier in the video, we've referred to mad horse, maple, ash, dogwood, horse chestnut. 3 trees with opposite leaves. This, you might recall from a previous example, is an ash. Now let's look at the leaf. Here's one. We have a pair of leaves here. 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 And even at the end, the leaves are still as opposites. Although these are shriveled, let's take a second and zoom in for the shape. Almost football shaped, but coming to a slight point at the end. The margin, or the edge of the leaf, is smooth. The bark on this tree gives it away. It can only be one kind. Who in the class can correctly identify this tree? Get close to this, I think, for them to see. This particular shrub grows in clusters. And perhaps up in here you can see some of the large paintbrushes that contain the fruit. Let's look more closely at the branch. Can you see that this branch is not smooth, but fuzzy?